Every woman knows the pain of being overlooked, dismissed, and told she isn't enough. For 26 years, Elira has lived this nightmare in the stone halls of Castle Drakmoor. She scrubs floors that nobles walk upon, serves meals to those who see her as worthless, and sleeps in servants' quarters while the kingdom's hierarchy crushes her spirit daily. Alphas rule with iron fists, betas serve their masters, and omegas like her exist only to endure in silence. This brutal order has remained unbroken for centuries, carved into law by kings who believed strength flowed only through alpha blood. But King Torvald, battle-scarred and 58 years old, stands before his assembled court today with an announcement that will change everything. His choice for queen and mother of his heirs is not the alpha duchess they expected, but the forgotten omega who has cleaned their halls in shadows. What could this aging warrior king possibly see in a woman the entire kingdom has dismissed as cursed? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first light of dawn crept through the narrow window slits of Castle Drakmoor, casting long shadows across the cold stone floors that Elira had been scrubbing since before the sun kissed the horizon. Her knees ached against the unforgiving granite, but she had learned long ago not to voice such complaints. The worn cleaning cloth in her hands, her constant companion for more years than she cared to count, had seen better days, much like herself. At 26, Elira possessed a quiet beauty that went unnoticed by those who mattered. Her auburn hair was always pulled back severely, hidden beneath a servant's cap, and her green eyes were kept downcast in the presence of nobility. She had perfected the art of invisibility, moving through the castle like a ghost who left only cleanliness in her wake. The great hall of Castle Drakmoor stretched before her like a cathedral of oppression. Massive stone pillars supported a vaulted ceiling that seemed to press down upon everyone beneath it, reminding all who entered of their place in the kingdom's rigid hierarchy. Tapestries depicting the glorious victories of alpha kings lined the walls, their threads gleaming with gold that caught the morning light. Each image told the same story, strength conquering weakness, nobility triumphing over the common, alpha blood proving its superiority over all others. "Move faster, Omega," hissed Lady Cordelia, a beta noblewoman whose sharp features seemed permanently etched with disdain. Her silk gown rustled as she swept past, the sound like autumn leaves scraping against stone. "The Alpha Lords will break their fast soon, and I will not have them see these floors in such a state." Elira's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but she kept her eyes fixed on the cloth in her hands. "Yes, my lady," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. The words tasted bitter, but they were necessary for survival. Lady Cordelia paused, her cold blue eyes studying Elira with the same expression one might reserve for examining an insect. "You know, I sometimes wonder why His Majesty tolerates your kind in his castle at all. Omegas are nothing but a reminder of weakness, a stain upon the purity of noble blood." The words struck like physical blows, but Elira had endured worse. She had been hearing variations of this speech since childhood, when she had first been brought to the castle as an orphaned servant. The circumstances of her arrival remained shrouded in mystery, a young child with no family name, no noble connections, and no explanation for how she had come to serve in the royal household. "Tell me, girl," Lady Cordelia continued, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "do you ever dream of being something more than what you are? Do you imagine yourself dressed in fine silks, dining at the high table with your betters?" Elira's hands stilled for the briefest moment before resuming their steady circular motions. "I dream only of serving faithfully, my lady." A cruel laugh escaped Lady Cordelia's lips. "How perfectly pathetic! You have been so thoroughly broken that you cannot even conceive of wanting more." She leaned closer, her perfume, expensive and cloying, filling Elira's nostrils. "That is as it should be. Know your place, Omega. and never forget it. As Lady Cordelia's footsteps faded down the corridor, Elira allowed herself a moment to breathe deeply. The familiar ache of humiliation settled in her chest, but beneath it lay something else, an ember of defiance that she kept carefully hidden. She had indeed dreamed of more, though she would never admit it to the likes of Lady Cordelia. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the castle slept and she was alone with her thoughts, she imagined a world where worth was measured by character rather than bloodline. The sound of approaching footsteps drew her attention, and she looked up to see old Henrik, the castle's head groundskeeper, making his way across the hall. His weathered face bore the lines of a man who had spent his 60-odd years in service to the crown, but his eyes held a kindness that had sustained Elira through many dark moments. "Morning, child," he said softly, glancing around to ensure they were alone. "Lady Cordelia's been at you again, I see." Elira managed a small smile. "Nothing I cannot handle, Henrik. You taught me well." Henrik had been like a father to her in the years since her arrival at the castle. He had shown her how to navigate the treacherous waters of noble society, how to blend into the background, and most importantly, how to protect the quiet strength that lived within her heart. "That I did," he agreed, his voice filled with a mixture of pride and sadness. "But sometimes I wonder if I did you a disservice, teaching you to hide so well. There's more to you than scrubbing floors, Elira. There, always has been." Before she could respond, the great doors of the hall burst open, and Sir Marcus, the king's personal guard, strode into the chamber. His presence immediately transformed the atmosphere. Servants who had been moving about their duties suddenly stood straighter, their movements more purposeful. "His Majesty requires the great hall to be prepared for a special assembly," Sir Marcus announced, his voice carrying the authority of the crown. "All nobles are to be present within the hour." Elira felt a chill run down her spine. Special assemblies were rare and usually meant significant changes were coming to the kingdom. She redoubled her efforts on the floors, wanting to finish her work before the nobles arrived. As if summoned by the announcement, the castle began to stir with unusual activity. Servants hurried through the corridors carrying messages, and the sound of voices echoed from the upper floors, where the nobility kept their chambers. There was an electricity in the air, a sense that something momentous was about to occur. Henrik placed a gentle hand on Elira's shoulder. "Whatever happens today, child, remember who you truly are, not what they tell you to be, but who you are in your heart." His words puzzled her, but before she could ask what he meant, he had already begun making his way toward the main doors. Elira found herself alone in the great hall, surrounded by the symbols of power and prestige that had defined her entire world. The worn cleaning cloth in her hands seemed to pulse with the weight of all the years she had spent in service, all the insults she had endured, all the dreams she had buried. She could hear the nobles beginning to gather in the corridors outside, their voices a mixture of curiosity and anticipation. Whatever King Torvald had to announce, it was significant enough to summon the entire court. Elira quickly gathered her cleaning supplies, preparing to retreat to the servants' quarters as protocol demanded. She had no business witnessing the affairs of her betters, but as she reached the servants' entrance, something made her pause. Perhaps it was Henrik's cryptic words, or perhaps it was simply the unusual energy that seemed to permeate the very stones of the castle. Whatever the reason, she found herself lingering just inside the doorway, hidden in the shadows but close enough to hear what transpired. The great doors opened with a ceremonial flourish, and the nobility of Castle Drakmoor filed into the hall. Like a parade of silken steel, Alpha Lords wore their power like armor, their faces stern and confident. Beta nobles followed in their wake, grateful for their place above the Omegas, but always mindful of their position below the Alphas. The hierarchy was as rigid and unforgiving as the stone walls that surrounded them. At the far end of the hall, the massive doors that led to the royal chambers swung open with a deep, resonant boom that seemed to shake the very foundation of the castle. King Torvald emerged, and even from her hidden position, Elira could feel the weight of his presence. At 58, the king was still a formidable figure. His broad shoulders bore the scars of countless battles, and his steel grey hair was pulled back to reveal a face that had been carved by years of difficult decisions and hard-won victories. There was something in his bearing today, a sense of purpose that seemed different from his usual royal demeanour. As the assembled nobles bowed in deference to their sovereign, Elira found herself holding her breath. She had seen the king from a distance countless times over the years, but there was something about this moment that felt different, significant, life-changing. King Torvald's voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of absolute authority. "My lords and ladies, I have summoned you here today to make an announcement that will shape the future of our kingdom." The hall fell silent, every ear straining to catch the king's words. Even the servants who moved about the periphery of the room seemed to freeze in anticipation. For too long, our kingdom has been guided by traditions that no longer serve us well, the king continued, his gaze sweeping across the assembled nobility. "We have measured worth by bloodline, rather than character, strength by birth, rather than spirit. Today that changes." A murmur of confusion rippled through the crowd. Such words were unprecedented, coming from an alpha king who had built his reign on the very traditions he now seemed to question. King Torvald raised his hand, and silence returned instantly. "I have chosen my queen, and through her, the future of our royal line. My choice may surprise you, but I have made it with careful consideration and absolute certainty." Elira pressed herself further back into the shadows, her heart pounding for reasons she could not name. The tension in the hall was palpable. Every noble present was likely wondering which alpha lady had captured the king's favor. "The woman who will bear my heirs and stand beside me as queen," King Torvald declared, his voice carrying to every corner of the great hall, "is one who has served this castle faithfully for many years. One who possesses a strength that has nothing to do with the circumstances of her birth and everything to do with the content of her character." The murmur that arose from the assembled nobles was no longer confused. It was shocked. Alpha ladies exchanged glances of disbelief, while beta nobles began to whisper among themselves with growing excitement. Surely the king could not mean what his words seemed to suggest, but King Torvald was not finished. His eyes scanned the hall with deliberate intensity, as if he could see through stone and shadow to the very heart of every person present. "Elira," he called, his voice cutting through the whispers like a blade through silk. "Step forward." For a moment, Elira was certain she had misheard. The name he had spoken could not be hers. There had to be another Elira, perhaps a beta noble she had never met, or an alpha lady from a distant province. But as the seconds stretched into eternity and no one else moved, the terrible truth began to dawn on her. The king was calling for her, the Omega servant. The woman with the worn cleaning cloth still clutched in her trembling hands. The silence that followed King Torvald's call was deafening. Every eye in the great hall searched for the woman who bore the name he had spoken, but their gazes passed over the shadowed doorway, where Elira stood frozen in disbelief. She felt as though the very air had been stolen from her lungs, as though the ground beneath her feet had suddenly become as insubstantial as morning mist. "Elira," the king repeated, his voice gentler now, but no less commanding. "I know you are here. Please, step forward." The cleaning cloth slipped from Elira's nerveless fingers, falling to the stone floor with a soft whisper that seemed to echo through the hall like thunder. Her legs felt like water, threatening to give way beneath her, but somehow she found the strength to move. Each step toward the center of the hall felt like walking through a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. As she emerged from the shadows, a collective gasp arose from the assembled nobles. Lady Cordelia's face had gone pale as winter snow, her mouth hanging open in an expression of pure shock. The Alpha Lords stood rigid with disbelief, their hands instinctively moving to the hilts of their ceremonial swords, as if they could somehow cut away this impossible reality. "This is madness," breathed Lord Aldrich, one of the most powerful Alpha nobles in the kingdom. His voice carried clearly through the stunned silence. "Your Majesty surely cannot mean to suggest that an Omega, a servant, could possibly—" "I mean to suggest nothing," King Torvald interrupted, his steel-grey eyes flashing with dangerous intensity. "I am declaring it as fact. Elira will be my queen and the mother of my heirs." The explosion of voices that followed was unlike anything the Great Hall had ever witnessed. Alpha Lords shouted their outrage, while Beta nobles whispered frantically. Among themselves, Lady Cordelia's voice rose above the din, shrill with indignation. "This is an abomination, a mockery of everything our kingdom stands for. An Omega can do whatever I declare she can do." King Torvald's voice boomed through the hall, silencing the protests as effectively as a physical blow. "I am your king, and my word is law. Any who question this decision question my authority to rule." Elira stood in the center of the chaos, feeling as though she existed in a bubble of surreal calm. The voices around her seemed to come from a great distance, and she found herself focusing on the king's face instead. There was something in his expression, a certainty, a conviction, that spoke of more than mere royal whim. This was not the rash decision of an aging monarch, but the calculated choice of a seasoned ruler. "Your Majesty," Lord Aldrich said visibly, struggling to control his temper, "surely you must see the impossibility of this situation. The bloodline, the traditions, the bloodline will be strengthened, not weakened," King Torvald replied firmly. "And as for traditions, they are worth preserving only when they serve the greater good. When they become chains that bind us to weakness and division, they must be broken." Lord Aldrich's face flushed red with barely contained rage. "The other kingdoms will see this as a sign of weakness. Our enemies will learn what I have already discovered," the king said, his gaze moving to Elira with an expression that was both protective and proud. "That true strength comes from unexpected places, and that the greatest leaders are often those who have known adversity intimately." Elira felt her cheeks burn under the weight of his attention. She wanted to speak, to protest that there had been some terrible mistake, but her voice seemed to have abandoned her entirely. The magnitude of what was happening was too vast to comprehend. She was a servant, an Omega, a woman who had spent her entire life being told she was worthless. How could she possibly be standing here, in the center of the Great Hall, while the King of the Realm declared his intention to make her his queen? "Begging your pardon, Your Majesty," Lady Cordelia said, her voice dripping with false deference, "but surely the girl should have some say in this matter. Perhaps she does not wish to be elevated so far above her natural station." All eyes turned to Elira, and she felt the weight of their collective gaze like a physical pressure. The Alpha Lords watched her with barely concealed contempt, clearly expecting her to refuse the king's offer and restore the natural order. The Beta nobles seemed caught between curiosity and horror, unsure what to make of this unprecedented situation. King Torvald stepped down from his throne, crossing the distance between them with measured strides. When he stood before her, Elira was struck by how much taller he was. She had never been this close to royalty before, and his presence was both intimidating and strangely comforting. "The choice is yours, Elira," he said quietly, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "I will not force this upon you, but I want you to know that my decision was not made lightly. I have watched you for longer than you might think, and I have seen qualities in you that would make any kingdom proud to call you queen." His words sent a shock through her system. The king had been watching her? How was that possible? She was invisible, forgettable, a shadow that cleaned and served and disappeared. Yet there was no deception in his eyes, no hint that his words were anything less than completely sincere. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible even to herself. "Why me? I am nothing, nobody." "You are far more than you know," King Torvald replied gently. "And if you accept my proposal, I will spend the rest of my days helping. You see yourself as I see you." The promise in his words was like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. For the first time in her life, someone was offering her more than mere survival. Someone was offering her a chance to become something greater than the sum of her circumstances. But the weight of the assembled court's attention was overwhelming. She could feel their skepticism, their outrage, their certainty that she should refuse. The pressure to maintain the status quo, to acknowledge her place and step back into the shadows, was almost unbearable. "Your Majesty," she began, her voice gaining strength as she spoke, "I am deeply honored by your faith in me, but surely you must see that I am not prepared for such responsibility. I know nothing of ruling, nothing of nobility. Knowledge can be learned," King Torvald said firmly. "Wisdom can be gained through experience. But the qualities that matter most, integrity, compassion, strength of character, these cannot be taught. They must be possessed from within. And you, Elira, possess them in abundance." Lord Aldrich could contain himself no longer. "This is preposterous. Your Majesty, you are asking us to accept a serving girl as our queen. The very idea makes a mockery of everything our ancestors built. Our ancestors built a kingdom on the principle that might makes right," King Torvald replied, turning to face the Alpha Lord with steely resolve. "But might without wisdom is merely brutality. I have ruled through strength for many years, and while it has brought us victories, it has not brought us peace. Perhaps it is time to try a different approach." The royal decree scroll was brought forward by Sir Marcus, its official seal gleaming in the morning light that streamed through the tall windows. The sight of it made the situation terrifyingly real. This was not a dream or a moment of royal fancy, but an actual decree that would be recorded in the annals of the kingdom's history. "The declaration has been prepared," Sir Marcus announced, his voice carefully neutral. "It requires only His Majesty's signature to become official law." King Torvald took the scroll, but he did not immediately sign it. Instead, he turned back to Elira, his expression grave. "The choice is still yours," he said. "If you accept, your life will change in ways you cannot imagine. There will be those who resent you, who will seek to undermine you at every turn. The path ahead will not be easy." Elira looked around the hall, taking in the faces that surrounded her. She saw disgust, outrage, disbelief, and in a few cases what might have been curiosity or even hope. These people would be her subjects if she accepted the king's proposal. They would look to her for leadership, for guidance, for strength she was not certain she possessed. But as her gaze returned to King Torvald's face, she saw something that gave her courage. He believed in her, not because of who she was born to be, but because of who she had chosen to become through years of hardship and quiet endurance. He was offering her not just a crown, but a chance to prove that worth was not determined by bloodline. "I accept," she said, her voice clear and steady despite the trembling in her hands. "I will do my best to be worthy of your faith in me, Your Majesty." The king's smile was radiant as he took up the quill and signed the decree with bold, decisive strokes. The moment his signature was complete, everything changed. Elira was no longer a servant, no longer an omega of no account. She was the future queen of the realm, chosen by the king himself. The reaction from the court was immediate and intense. Several Alpha Lords stormed from the hall, their faces dark with rage. Lady Cordelia remained, but her expression suggested she was already calculating how to use this development to her advantage. The Beta nobles seemed split between those who were scandalized and those who appeared intrigued by the precedent this set. "Behold your future queen," King Torvald announced to those who remained. "Any who serve her faithfully serve me. Any who seek to harm or undermine her will answer to me personally." As the implications of this moment began to sink in, Elira realized that her life, and indeed the very fabric of the kingdom, had been forever altered. She was no longer the invisible servant who cleaned floors in the shadows. She was about to become the most visible woman in the realm, with all the dangers and responsibilities that entailed. The worn cleaning cloth still lay on the floor where it had fallen, forgotten now in the wake of such momentous change. Soon, she would have to leave it behind entirely, along with everything else that had defined her previous existence. But as King Torvald offered her his arm and began to escort her from the great hall, Elira felt a spark of something she had never allowed herself to experience before: hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, she could become the queen he believed her to be. 3 days had passed since the announcement that changed everything, and Elira still felt like she was living someone else's life. The royal chambers that had been prepared for her were larger than any space she had ever inhabited. Larger, in fact, than some of the common rooms where multiple servants had shared quarters. The walls were adorned with tapestries depicting scenes of royal hunts and courtly life, and the furniture was carved from rich, dark wood that gleamed in the light of silver candelabras. She stood before a looking-glass that was taller than she, was studying her reflection as if she might find answers in the face that stared back at her. The servant's rough-spun dress had been replaced with a gown of deep blue silk that felt foreign against her skin. The fabric was so fine that she was afraid to move too quickly, certain she would somehow damage it beyond repair. A gentle knock at the door interrupted her contemplation. "Enter," she called, still marveling at how different her voice sounded in this vast space. Master Edmund, the castle's chief etiquette instructor, entered with his usual precise bearing. He was a man of middle years whose every movement spoke of careful breeding and noble education. His task, as King Torvald had explained, was to prepare Elira for the responsibilities and expectations of royal life. "Good morning, Your Highness," he said with a respectful bow. The title still sent a shock through Elira's system every time she heard it. "I trust you slept well?" "Well enough," she replied, though the truth was that the enormous four-poster bed felt like sleeping in a meadow after years of narrow servants' cots. She had spent most of the night staring at the intricately carved ceiling, wondering if she would ever feel at home in such splendor. "Excellent. Today we shall begin with the fundamentals of court protocol, the way you walk, speak, and present. Yourself will be scrutinized by every person you encounter. It is essential that you project both confidence and grace." Master Edmund began his instruction with posture, guiding Elira through the proper way to stand, sit, and move through a room. Each gesture had meaning. Each position conveyed a message about status and authority. After years of making herself as small and invisible as possible, learning to command attention felt like trying to speak a foreign language. "Your shoulders back, Your Highness. You are no longer trying to avoid notice. You are the future queen, and people should be honored to receive your attention." The words were kindly meant, but they highlighted the vast chasm between who she had been and who she was expected to become. Elira straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin, trying to embody the confidence Master Edmund was teaching her to project. As they worked through the morning lessons, Elira became aware of movement in the corridors outside her chambers. Servants passed by more frequently than seemed necessary, and she could hear the whispered conversations that followed in their wake. Word of the king's choice had spread throughout the castle, and she could imagine the speculation and gossip that accompanied every mention of her name. "The morning meal will be served in the small dining hall," Master Edmund informed her as their lesson concluded. "His Majesty has requested that you join him there. This will be your first semi-public appearance since the announcement, so it is important that you comport yourself with appropriate dignity." The walk through the castle corridors was an exercise in endurance. Servants who had worked alongside her for years now bowed as she passed, their faces carefully neutral, but their eyes filled with questions and disbelief. Guards who had never acknowledged her existence now stood at attention when she approached. The transformation felt surreal, as if she were an actress playing a role in some elaborate court drama. The small dining hall was more intimate than the great hall, but it still dwarfed any space Elira was accustomed to occupying. King Torvald was already seated at the head of the table, reviewing what appeared to be official documents while he broke his fast. He looked up as she entered, and his face brightened with genuine pleasure. "Elira," he said, rising to greet her. "You look lovely this morning. The blue suits you well." The simple silver circlet that had been placed in her chambers caught the morning light as she curtsied, a gesture Master Edmund had drilled her in only hours before. The circlet was her first piece of royal jewelry, a tangible symbol of her new status that felt impossibly precious and terrifyingly fragile. "Thank you, Your Majesty. Master Edmund has been most patient with my instruction." King Torvald gestured for her to sit at his right hand, a position of honor that would have been unthinkable just days ago. "I hope you don't mind the informality of taking our meal together, but I thought it might be easier for you to grow accustomed to royal life gradually, rather than being thrust immediately into the full spectacle of court dining." His consideration touched her deeply. Here was a man who could command absolute obedience from everyone in his kingdom, yet he was concerned about her comfort and adjustment. "I am grateful for your thoughtfulness, Your Majesty. Please," he said with a gentle smile, "when we are alone, you may call me Torvald. We are to be husband and wife after all. Such formality will not be necessary between us in private." The reminder of their impending marriage sent a flutter of nervousness through her stomach. In all the shock and adjustment of the past few days, she had barely had time to consider the personal implications of becoming not just a queen, but a wife to a man she barely knew. "I must confess," she said carefully, "that I know very little about you beyond your reputation as a just and capable ruler. If we are to be married, perhaps we might learn something of each other." Torvald set aside his documents and gave her his full attention. "A wise suggestion. What would you like to know? Why did you choose me?" The question tumbled out before she could stop it, carrying with it all the bewilderment and insecurity she had been struggling to contain. "I understand that you see something in me that others do not, but I cannot fathom what that might be." He was quiet for a long moment, his grey eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her want to look away. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of deep conviction. "For 30 years, I have ruled this kingdom through strength and decisive action. I have led armies, conquered enemies, and expanded our borders. But in all that time, I have also watched our society become increasingly rigid, increasingly cruel to those who were born into circumstances beyond their control." He paused to take a sip of his wine before continuing. "I have seen alpha lords abuse their power, beta nobles scramble for favor, and omegas like yourself endure treatment that would be considered barbaric if applied to livestock. This is not the legacy I wish to leave behind." "But surely any number of alpha or beta women could help you change such things. Could they?" Torvald asked gently. "Those who have never known hardship rarely understand the suffering of others. Those who have always held power seldom question the systems that granted it to them. You, Elira, have experienced the worst our society has to offer, yet you have not allowed it to make you bitter or cruel. That is a strength more valuable than any noble bloodline." His words stirred something deep within her, a recognition of truth she had never allowed herself to acknowledge. She had endured, yes, but she had also found ways to show kindness to others in similar circumstances, to offer comfort to fellow servants who struggled under the weight of their station. "I have watched you for 2 years, Torvald continued, "since the day I saw you give your own meal to a kitchen boy who had been punished for breaking a serving dish. You went hungry that night, rather than see a child suffer, and you did it without thought of reward or recognition. The memory surfaced in her mind. Little Thomas, barely 8 years old, sobbing in the pantry after cook had denied him supper. For his clumsiness, she had acted on instinct, sharing her small portion of bread and cheese without considering the consequences. You notice that? I make it my business to notice how people treat those who have less power than themselves. It reveals more about character than all the noble declarations and ceremonial displays in the world. A commotion in the corridor outside interrupted their conversation. Raised voices and the sound of rapid footsteps suggested some sort of disturbance, and both Torvald and Elira turned toward the door as Sir Marcus appeared. "Your Majesty," he said with a bow, "forgive the interruption, but Lord Aldrich and several other Alpha Lords are requesting an immediate audience. They claim it is a matter of urgent importance to the kingdom." Torvald's expression hardened slightly. "I see, and I suppose this urgent matter has nothing to do with my choice of bride." "I could not say, Your Majesty. They have requested privacy for their concerns." "Very well. Tell them I will see them in my study in 1 hour. That should give them time to cool their tempers and remember their manners." As Sir Marcus departed, Torvald turned back to Elira with an apologetic expression. "I am afraid this is likely the first of many such urgent concerns we will face. Are you prepared for the resistance we are certain to encounter?" The question was serious, and Elira considered it carefully before responding. "I am frightened," she admitted honestly, "but I am also determined. If you believe I can do this, then I will find a way to prove you right." His smile was warm with approval and something that might have been affection. "That is exactly the response I hoped to. Here, remember, Elira, you are no longer fighting this battle alone. We face whatever comes together." The word "together" resonated in her mind long after their meal had ended, and she had returned to her chambers for the afternoon's lessons. For the first time in her life, she was not alone in facing the challenges before her. The thought was both terrifying and deeply comforting, like standing at the edge of a vast ocean while holding the hand of someone strong enough to keep her from drowning. The royal gown that had been delivered to Elira's chambers that morning was a work of art that made her previous silk dress seem simple by comparison. Embroidered with threads of gold and silver, it depicted scenes of royal coronations and featured intricate beadwork that caught the light with every movement. Yet as beautiful as it was, wearing it made Elira feel like an imposter dressed in costume for a play she had never auditioned for. Today marked her first public appearance since the announcement, a ceremony in the castle's main courtyard where she would be formally presented to the gathered citizens. The very thought made her stomach churn with anxiety, but she forced herself to stand still as her new lady's maid, a kind woman named Clara, made final adjustments to the gown's elaborate train. "You look magnificent, Your Highness," Clara said, with genuine warmth. Unlike many of the castle's servants, she had adapted to Elira's new status with grace and apparent sincerity. "The people will be honored to see their future queen." Elira studied her reflection in the looking-glass, searching for some sign of the confidence she was supposed to project. The woman staring back at her looked the part of royalty, but beneath the finery she felt like the same frightened servant who had scrubbed floors just a week ago. A sharp knock at the door interrupted her thoughts, followed by the entrance of Lady Cordelia. The Beta noblewoman's expression was carefully composed, but Elira could detect the underlying tension in her rigid posture and the slight tightness around her eyes. "Your Highness," Lady Cordelia said with a curtsy that was technically proper, but somehow managed to convey reluctance. "I have been tasked with accompanying you to today's ceremony and ensuring that protocol is properly observed." The assignment was clearly not one Lady Cordelia had sought, and Elira wondered if King Torvald had deliberately chosen someone who would be motivated to find fault with her performance. It would be a harsh but effective way to prepare her for the scrutiny she would face as queen. "I am grateful for your guidance, Lady Cordelia," Elira replied, trying to project the gracious authority Master Edmund had been teaching her. Lady Cordelia's smile was as sharp as a blade. "Of course, Your Highness, though I must say, the transition from servant to royalty is quite remarkable to witness. I do hope you won't find the attention too overwhelming." The barb was delivered with such practiced sweetness that anyone overhearing might mistake it for genuine concern. But Elira had spent years learning to read the subtle cruelties of noble speech, and she recognized the challenge for what it was. "I find that previous experience with hard work serves one well in any new endeavor," Elira responded evenly. "I am confident that the lessons of my past will help me serve the kingdom faithfully in the future." A flicker of surprise crossed Lady Cordelia's features. Clearly, she had expected Elira to be easily flustered by such pointed remarks. The moment of silence that followed was charged with the tension of two women taking each other's measure. The sound of trumpets from the courtyard below signaled that the ceremony was about to begin. Clara handed Elira a pair of delicate silk gloves, while Lady Cordelia made a show of inspecting her appearance with critical eyes. "I suppose you'll do," Lady Cordelia pronounced finally. "Though I do hope you remember to keep your chin up. The people expect their royalty to project confidence regardless of their origins." As they made their way through the castle corridors toward the main courtyard, Elira became acutely aware of the whispered conversations that followed in their wake. Servants pressed themselves against the walls as they passed, their eyes wide, with curiosity and something that might have been hope. For many of them, she represented the impossible made real, the idea that circumstances of birth need not determine one's entire life. The great doors leading to the courtyard stood open, revealing a sea of faces that seemed to stretch beyond the horizon. Citizens from throughout the kingdom had gathered to witness this unprecedented moment, and their voices created a low hum of anticipation that filled the air like distant thunder. King Torvald stood at the center of a raised platform, resplendent in his royal robes and crown. When he saw Elira approaching, his face brightened with what appeared to be genuine pride and affection. The sight of his approval gave her the courage she needed to step forward into the scrutiny of hundreds of watching eyes. "My people," King Torvald's voice carried clearly across the courtyard, "I present to you Lady Elira, my chosen bride and your future queen." The response from the crowd was mixed. Cheers from some quarters, surprised murmurs from others, and what sounded like disapproval from a few scattered groups. Elira forced herself to stand tall and project the confidence she didn't entirely feel. Remembering Master Edmund's lessons about the importance of bearing and presence, an elderly woman near the front of the crowd called out, "She's just a servant. How can a servant be our queen?" Before King Torvald could respond, Elira stepped forward. The moment felt crucial, her first opportunity to speak for herself before the people she would one day rule. "You are right," she said, her voice carrying more strongly than she had expected. "I was indeed a servant, and I am proud of the honest work I have done. I have cleaned your castle, served your nobles, and lived among the common people of this kingdom. I know what it means to work hard for little reward, to be dismissed and overlooked, to struggle for basic dignity." The crowd had grown quiet, listening intently to her words. "If that makes me unfit to be your queen, then so be it," Elira continued. "But if understanding the lives of common people, if knowing both hardship and hope, if having learned that true worth comes from character rather than circumstance, if these things might make me a better ruler, then I hope you will give me the chance to prove myself worthy of your trust." The silence that followed her words seemed to stretch for an eternity. Then, slowly, applause began to ripple through the crowd. It started with the servants and common folk, but gradually spread until even some of the beta nobles were clapping. The Alpha Lords remained notably silent, their faces masks of barely concealed displeasure. King Torvald placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, and when she looked up at him, she saw something in his eyes that made her heart skip. "Well spoken," he murmured, just loud enough for her to hear. "You are already more of a queen than you know." As the ceremony continued with formal proclamations and traditional rituals, Elira found herself studying the faces in the crowd. She saw curiosity, skepticism, hope, and resentment in equal measure. These people would be her subjects, and winning their acceptance would be a challenge that went far beyond learning proper etiquette and court protocol. Later that evening, as she sat in her chambers reflecting on the day's events, Clara brought her disturbing news. "Your Highness," the maid said quietly, glancing around as if afraid of being overheard. "There's been talk among some of the servants. Not everyone is pleased with your elevation." "What kind of talk?" Elira asked, though she suspected she already knew. "Some say it's unnatural for an Omega to rise so high. Others worry that it will bring misfortune to the kingdom. And there are whispers that certain nobles are already plotting to address the situation." The euphemism sent a chill down Elira's spine. She had been naive to think that acceptance would come easily, or that her new position would protect her from those who viewed her very existence as a threat to the natural order. "Thank you for telling me, Clara. I appreciate your honesty and your loyalty." That night, as Elira lay in her enormous bed staring at the shadows dancing on the ceiling, she realized that the announcement and public ceremony had been only the beginning of her trials. The real test would be surviving long enough to prove that King Torvald's faith in her had been justified. She thought of the worn cleaning cloth she had carried for so many years, now discarded and forgotten in favor of silk gloves and royal regalia. That simple piece of fabric had been a symbol of her servitude, but it had also been a reminder of her resilience. She had endured years of thankless labor and casual cruelty, emerging with her spirit intact and her capacity for compassion undimmed. If she could survive that, perhaps she could survive this as well. The enemies she faced now were more sophisticated and dangerous than the petty cruelties of daily servitude. But they were still just people. People motivated by fear, pride, and the desperate need to maintain their place in a hierarchy that was finally beginning to crack. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new lessons, and undoubtedly new attempts to undermine her position. But tonight, for the first time since King Torvald had called her name in the Great Hall, Elira allowed herself to believe that she might actually succeed in becoming the queen he believed her to be. The poisoned chalice sat innocuously on the silver tray beside Elira's evening meal, its ornate engravings catching the candlelight in patterns that seemed to dance with malevolent intent. She had nearly raised it to her lips when Clara's sharp intake of breath stopped her hand midway to her mouth. "Your Highness, wait!" Clara whispered urgently, her face pale with terror. "Something is wrong with the wine. Look at how it catches. The light, there's an oily sheen on the surface that shouldn't be there." Elira set the chalice down carefully, her heart hammering against her ribs. The implications of what Clara had observed were chilling. Someone within the castle walls had attempted to murder her, and they had come terrifyingly close to succeeding. "Fetch Sir Marcus, immediately," Elira commanded, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "But do so quietly. We don't want to alert whoever did this that their attempt has failed." As Clara hurried from the room, Elira stared at the chalice that might have ended her life. The wine within was a deep burgundy that would have masked the appearance of most poisons, and the rich flavor would have concealed any unusual taste until it was far too late. Someone had planned this carefully, knowing her habits and routines well enough to target her evening meal when she would be alone and unguarded. Sir Marcus arrived within minutes, his hand already resting on the hilt of his sword. He took one. "Look at the chalice," and his expression grew grim. "With your permission, Your Highness, I'll have this analyzed by the castle's physician. But from the appearance alone, I would say this contains wolfsbane, a poison that would have killed you within the hour." The confirmation of her fears sent a wave of cold terror through her body, followed immediately by a surge of anger. She had known there would be resistance to her elevation, but she had not expected outright murder attempts so soon. "Who had access to my chambers this evening?" she asked. "The usual servants who prepare your meals, several nobles who requested audiences earlier today, and the guards who patrol this section of the castle," Sir Marcus replied. "I'm afraid the list of potential suspects is quite extensive." King Torvald arrived as Sir Marcus was securing the evidence, his face thunderous with rage when he learned what had transpired. Elira had never seen him truly angry before, and the sight was both frightening and oddly comforting. Here was someone who would protect her with the full force of his authority. "This is treason of the highest order," he declared, his voice carrying the promise of terrible retribution. "I want every person who had access to these chambers questioned thoroughly, and I want it done tonight." "Your Majesty," Elira said carefully, "perhaps we should consider this more strategically. If we react too obviously, we might drive the conspirators deeper underground. Better to let them think their attempt went unnoticed while we gather information about their network." Both men turned to look at her with expressions of surprise, and Elira realized she had just demonstrated a capacity for political thinking that neither had expected from someone of her background. "An astute observation," King Torvald said approvingly, "but I will not have you exposed to further danger while we play such games." "Then we must find a middle path," Elira suggested. "Increase security without making it obvious. Investigate quietly while maintaining the appearance of normalcy. If there are conspirators in the castle, we need to draw them out rather than simply punishing this single attempt." The next several hours were spent in careful planning. Additional guards were assigned to Elira's protection, but they were positioned discreetly to avoid creating obvious changes in routine. A trusted servant was assigned to taste all of her food before it reached her, but this precaution was implemented subtly to avoid alerting potential poisoners to their discovery. Most importantly, Elira insisted on maintaining her regular schedule of lessons and public appearances. She would not allow fear to drive her into hiding, nor would she give her enemies the satisfaction of seeing her cower. "Your courage is admirable," King Torvald told her as they reviewed the security arrangements, "but I confess it terrifies me as well. You are more precious to me than you realize, and the thought of losing you—" He stopped himself before completing the sentence, but the emotion in his voice spoke volumes about the depth of his feelings. Elira felt her heart flutter at the implied confession, even as the rational part of her mind wondered if his attachment was truly personal or simply protective of his political investment. "I am not going anywhere," she assured him firmly. "It will take more than poison to remove me from your side." The promise seemed to comfort him, though she could see the worry that lingered in his eyes. As they parted for the evening, with significantly more guards stationed outside her chambers, Elira reflected on how much her life had changed in such a short time. Just weeks ago, her greatest concern had been completing her daily tasks without drawing unwanted attention. Now she was navigating assassination attempts and political conspiracies while learning to rule a kingdom. The poisoned chalice had been a stark reminder that her position was far from secure, but it had also revealed something important about herself. When faced with mortal danger, she had not collapsed in terror or begged for protection. Instead, she had thought strategically about how to use the situation to her advantage. Perhaps there was more of the queen in her than she had dared to believe. Over the following days, the investigation proceeded quietly but thoroughly. Sir Marcus's discreet inquiries revealed a network of alpha nobles who had been meeting secretly since the announcement of her engagement. Their discussions, according to informants among the castle staff, had grown increasingly heated as they realized King Torvald was serious about his choice. Lord Aldrich appeared to be at the center of these discussions, though proving his direct involvement in the poisoning attempt proved more challenging. He was careful to maintain plausible deniability while encouraging others to take more direct action. "He's playing a dangerous game," King Torvald observed during one of their private strategy sessions. He wants you gone, but he doesn't want to be directly responsible for your death. That makes him both more dangerous and more vulnerable than a simple assassin would be. Elira found herself thinking more strategically about the political landscape of the court. She began to identify potential allies among the beta nobles who might benefit from changes to the rigid hierarchy, and she made careful overtures to servants and common folk who could serve as her eyes and ears throughout the castle. Her relationship with King Torvald deepened as they worked together to navigate these treacherous waters. She began to see beyond the crown and royal bearing to the man beneath, someone who carried the weight of difficult decisions with grace, who genuinely cared about the welfare of his people, and who possessed a dry sense of humor that emerged during their private conversations. "You realize," he told her one evening as they reviewed intelligence reports, "that you are becoming quite formidable as a political strategist. I'm beginning to think my enemies should be more afraid of you than they are of me." The compliment warmed her, but it also highlighted the growing complexity of her position. She was no longer just a servant elevated to royalty. She was becoming a power in her own right, someone who could think tactically and inspire loyalty among people who had initially dismissed her. The poisoned chalice sat in the castle's evidence chamber, a tangible reminder of how high the stakes had become. But rather than intimidating her into submission, the attempt on her life had clarified something important. She was no longer fighting just for survival, but for the right to shape the future of the kingdom. And that was a battle she was determined to win. The War Council seal, pressed into the red wax, bore the image of crossed swords beneath a crown, a symbol that had not been used in over a decade. Its appearance on the urgent dispatch that arrived at dawn meant only one thing: the kingdom faced external threats serious enough to require immediate military response. King Torvald stood over the massive oak table in his private study. Maps and intelligence reports spread before him like a complex puzzle. The morning light, streaming through the tall windows, illuminated the grave concern etched into his features as he studied the positions of enemy forces gathering along their borders. "The situation is more serious than we initially believed," he said to Elira, who sat across from him reviewing her own set of documents. Over the past weeks, he had begun including her in matters of state, recognizing that her perspective often revealed insights he might otherwise miss. "The Blackrock Confederacy has allied with the northern clans," Elira observed, tracing the movements indicated on the map with her finger. "If they coordinate their attacks, they could force us to fight on two fronts simultaneously." King Torvald nodded grimly. "And they're counting on internal divisions to weaken our response. Word of our unconventional engagement has spread beyond our borders. Our enemies see it as a sign of weakness, a crack they can exploit." The irony was bitter. The very choice that had the potential to strengthen their kingdom from within was being used by outside forces to justify aggression. Elira felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. "Perhaps they're right to see it as weakness," she said quietly. "If my presence here causes our people to question your judgment, if it provides our enemies with justification for war, stop." King Torvald's voice was firm but gentle. "I will not have you blame yourself for the ambitions of warmongers and the prejudices of fools. The choice I made was correct, regardless of how others choose to interpret it." He moved around the table to stand beside her, his hand coming to rest on her shoulder in a gesture that had become familiar over the weeks of working together. The touch sent warmth through her body, a reminder of the growing connection between them that went far beyond political necessity. "Besides," he continued with a slight smile, "I have seen how you think through complex problems. I suspect that having you involved in our military planning will prove to be an advantage our enemies have not anticipated." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation, and Sir Marcus entered with a scroll bearing the royal seal of a neighboring kingdom. "Your Majesty," urgent correspondence from King Aldwyn of Westmarch. His messenger stressed the critical nature of the contents. Torvald broke the seal and read quickly, his expression growing darker with each line. When he finished, he passed the letter to Elira, who felt her own heart sink as she absorbed its contents. "King Aldwyn is withdrawing from our mutual defense treaty," she summarized. "He claims that recent developments in our court make us an unreliable ally, and he cannot risk association with a kingdom that has abandoned its commitment to traditional values." "Traditional values," Torvald repeated with bitter irony. What King Aldwyn really means is that he fears our example might inspire his own subjects to question why they should accept a system that keeps them oppressed based solely on the circumstances of their birth. The loss of Westmarch as an ally was a devastating blow. Their military support would have been crucial in the coming conflict, and their withdrawal would likely encourage other kingdoms to distance themselves as well. "We need to respond to this immediately," Elira said, her mind already working through possible approaches. "But perhaps we can turn this challenge into an opportunity." "How so?" "If our enemies see our internal changes as weakness, let them continue to believe that. Meanwhile, we use those same changes to strengthen our actual military capabilities. The common people of this kingdom have more reason to fight for us now than they ever had before. They're fighting for the possibility of a better future, not just to preserve a system that has oppressed them." Torvald's eyes lit up with understanding. "You're suggesting we recruit from populations that have traditionally been excluded from military service?" "Exactly. Omegas may not be physically as strong as alphas, but many are intelligent, resourceful, and highly motivated. Betas have been underutilized because they were seen as less capable than alphas. If we can organize and train these populations effectively, we could field an army unlike anything our enemies expect to face," Torvald finished, his voice filled with growing excitement. "They're preparing to fight the same hidebound kingdom we've always been, not the kingdom we're becoming." The next several hours were spent in intensive planning. Messages were dispatched to military commanders throughout the realm, calling for an expansion of recruitment beyond traditional alpha-dominated units. Training programs were designed to capitalize on the unique strengths different populations could bring to the kingdom's defense. Elira found herself taking on responsibilities that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. She was tasked with organizing support networks among Omega and Beta communities, building the logistics infrastructure that would be needed to support expanded military operations, and developing communication strategies that would maintain morale during the difficult times ahead. "I never expected to be planning military campaigns," she confessed to Torvald during a brief break in their work. "A month ago, my greatest strategic challenge was figuring out how to clean the Great Hall efficiently, and now you're helping to revolutionize how our kingdom approaches warfare," he replied with obvious pride. "I told you that you possessed qualities that would make any kingdom proud to call you queen. This is what I meant." Their eyes met across the map-covered table, and Elira felt the familiar flutter of attraction that had been growing stronger with each passing day. The crisis they faced was bringing them closer together, forcing them to rely on each other in ways that went beyond political convenience. "Torvald," she said, using his given name as he had requested weeks earlier, "whatever happens in the coming conflict, I want you to know that I am honored to stand beside you, not just as your chosen queen, but as your partner in this fight." He reached across the table to take her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that felt both intimate and strengthening. "We will face whatever comes together," he promised. "And when we emerge victorious, because we will emerge victorious, we will have built something entirely new. A kingdom where worth is measured by character and contribution, not by the accident of birth." The War Council's seal glinted in the afternoon light, its crossed swords a reminder of the battles to come. But as Elira looked at the man beside her, and thought of the loyal people they were fighting to protect, she felt a confidence she had never experienced before. They were no longer just defending the old kingdom. They were fighting to birth a new one. The external threats gathering on their borders were formidable, but they were not insurmountable, and the internal opposition that sought to undermine their union would soon discover that they had underestimated both the king's resolve and the strength of the woman he had chosen to stand beside him. The real war was just beginning, but Elira was no longer the frightened servant who had been called from the shadows. She was becoming the queen this kingdom needed, one who understood both the value of tradition and the necessity of change, one who could inspire loyalty through shared struggle rather than demanding obedience through inherited privilege. The future remained uncertain, but for the first time since this extraordinary journey had begun, Elira felt truly ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The ancient bloodline medallion felt warm against Elira's palm as she turned it over in the candlelight, studying the intricate engravings that had been hidden beneath decades of tarnish. Hendrik had pressed it into her hands just moments before, his weathered face grave with the weight of secrets he had carried for over 20 years. "This belonged to your mother," he said quietly, glancing toward the door of her chambers to ensure they would not be overheard. Lady Ravenna of House Thornwick, rightful heir to the northern duchies before they fell to the Blackrock Confederacy. The revelation hit Elira like a physical blow, leaving her speechless as she stared at the medallion that bore the crest of a noble house she had never heard mentioned in connection with herself. The symbol etched into the silver was elegant and complex, a thorn bush crowned with stars, surrounded by ancient runes that spoke of power and legacy. "That's impossible," she whispered, though even as she spoke the words, pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed began clicking into place. "I'm an orphan, a servant. You are the last surviving member of one of the most powerful bloodlines in the northern kingdoms," Henrik interrupted gently. "Your mother fled here when you were barely 2 years old, seeking sanctuary after the Confederacy murdered the rest of your family and seized your ancestral lands." The floor seemed to shift beneath Elira's feet as the implications of this revelation washed over her. Everything she thought she knew about herself, about her place in the world, had been a carefully constructed lie designed to protect her from enemies who would have killed her for the blood that ran in her veins. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Henrik's expression was troubled as he moved to the window, peering out at the darkening sky. "Because King Torvald's choice of you was no accident, child. He has known the truth of your identity since shortly after you arrived at the castle. His decision to make you queen was as much about reclaiming your rightful inheritance as it was about following his heart." The words struck her like lightning, illuminating connections she had been too naive to see. The way Torvald had watched her, the certainty with which he had defended his choice, the strategic thinking that had seemed to come so naturally to her. It all made sense now in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. "He knew." The question came out as half accusation, half plea for understanding. "All this time, he knew who I really was. He discovered it gradually," Henrik explained, settling into a chair across from her. "When you first arrived, your mother swore me to secrecy about your true identity. She feared that revealing your bloodline would make you a target for the same forces that had destroyed your family. King Torvald honored that secret for years, even as he began to suspect the truth." Elira closed her eyes, trying to process the magnitude of what she was learning. The modest servant who had cleaned floors and accepted abuse without complaint was actually nobility. Not just any nobility, but the heir to lands and titles that had been stolen from her family through violence and treachery. "The northern duchies," she said slowly, memories beginning to surface like forgotten dreams. "I remember fragments, a tall castle with towers that seemed to touch the clouds, gardens full of flowers I've never seen since, a woman with red hair like mine, who sang. To me in the evenings, your mother, Henrik confirmed sadly. Lady Ravenna was renowned for her beauty and intelligence, but also for her compassion toward those less fortunate. She implemented reforms in the northern duchies that improved life for common folk and Omegas alike. It said that the Blackrock Confederacy targeted your family not just for your wealth, but because your mother's example was inspiring similar changes in neighboring kingdoms. The parallels to her current situation were unmistakable and chilling. Here she was, once again in a position where her very existence challenged the established order, once again facing enemies who saw her as a threat to their power and privilege. "Does this change anything?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Between Torvald and myself, I mean. Was his affection real, or was it all part of some elaborate political strategy?" Henrik's expression softened with understanding. "Child, I have watched that man for more years than I care to count. I have seen him evaluate potential alliances, arrange marriages of convenience, and make countless decisions based purely on strategic advantage. What I see in his eyes when he looks at you is something entirely different. But surely the political benefits of this match are significant," Elira pressed, needing to understand the full scope of what this revelation meant. "If I am truly the heir to the northern duchies, then your marriage to King Torvald provides legal justification for military action to reclaim those lands from the Confederacy," Henrik finished. "Yes, the political benefits are substantial, but they do not diminish the genuine feelings that have developed between you." A soft knock at the door interrupted their conversation, followed by Clara's voice announcing that King Torvald was requesting an immediate audience. Elira felt her heart racing as she realized she would now have to confront him with this newfound knowledge. "Send him in," she called, her voice steadier than she felt. King Torvald entered with his usual confident bearing, but she could see the tension in his shoulders and the carefully controlled expression on his face. He knew why Henrik had come to see her, and he was prepared for the conversation that would follow. "I see Henrik has finally told you the truth," he said without preamble, his grey eyes searching her face for signs of her reaction. "Why didn't you tell me yourself?" The question carried years of accumulated confusion and hurt. "All this time, you let me believe I was nothing, nobody, because you needed to discover your own strength first," Torvald replied firmly. "If I had simply announced that you were nobility by birth, you would have been queen in name only. The court would have accepted your bloodline while continuing to dismiss your character. But now you have proven yourself worthy of the crown through your own actions and abilities." The logic was sound, but it did little to ease the sense of betrayal she felt at learning her entire life had been built on deception, however well-intentioned. "The assassination attempt," she said suddenly, pieces clicking into place. "It wasn't just about preventing a servant from becoming queen. Someone knows who I really am." Torvald's expression darkened. "Lord Aldrich has been in communication with agents of the Blackrock Confederacy. We believe he discovered your true identity and informed them of your survival. The poison was likely their first attempt to eliminate a threat they thought they had dealt with decades ago." The revelation sent a chill down her spine as she realized the full scope of the danger she faced. She wasn't just dealing with disgruntled nobles who opposed her elevation. She was facing the same enemies who had murdered her family and stolen her inheritance. "What happens now?" she asked, looking between Henrik and Torvald. "Do we reveal the truth publicly? Use my bloodline to rally support for military action against the Confederacy? That decision is yours to make," Torvald said seriously. "You could continue as you have been, allowing people to believe you rose from humble circumstances through merit alone. Or you could reclaim your birthright and demand justice for the crimes committed against your family." Elira looked down at the medallion in her hands, feeling the weight of generations of ancestors who had worn it before her. She thought of her mother, forced to flee her homeland to protect her child. She thought of the family members she would never know, murdered, for the crime of standing in the way of the Confederacy's ambitions. "I want both," she said finally, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "I want people to know that I earned my place through character and ability, but I also want them to understand that noble blood means nothing without noble actions. And I want the Blackrock Confederacy to pay for what they did to my family." Torvald smiled, and she could see pride and affection warring with concern in his expression. "Then we go to war, my lady, not just to defend our kingdom, but to reclaim your rightful inheritance and honor the memory of those who died protecting you." As Henrik quietly withdrew from the chamber, leaving them alone with the enormity of what lay ahead, Elira felt a transformation taking place within her that went beyond anything she had experienced since this journey began. She was no longer just a servant elevated to royalty, or even a woman chosen for her character and strength. She was Lady Elira of House Thornwick, rightful heir to the Northern Duchies, and she was coming home to claim what had always been hers. The war that was coming would be fought not just for the future of their kingdom, but for justice, for legacy, and for the right of the innocent to live without fear of those who would destroy them for power. The medallion seemed to pulse with warmth in her hand, as if the spirits of her ancestors were lending her their strength for the battles to come. The War Council map spread across the great table like a tapestry of impending conflict, its surface marked with red pins indicating enemy positions and blue flags showing their own forces. Dawn was breaking over Castle Drakmoor, casting long shadows through the tall windows of the strategy room, where the kingdom's most trusted advisors had been working through the night. Elira stood at Torvald's right hand, no longer the uncertain woman who had once questioned her place in these halls. The revelation of her true heritage had transformed not just her understanding of herself, but her entire presence. She wore confidence like armor now, her bearing reflecting both her noble blood and the strength she had earned through years of adversity. "The Confederacy forces have crossed our northern border in 3 places, Sir Marcus reported, his finger tracing the enemy movements on the map. "Their advance units are moving faster than we anticipated, likely trying to reach our major settlements before we can organize a proper defense. They're counting on our forces being demoralized by internal division," Lord Garrett, one of the few alpha nobles who had remained loyal, observed grimly. "If they can present this as a conquest of a weakened kingdom rather than an invasion of the united realm, other territories might join them rather than risk facing the same fate." Elira studied the map with eyes that had been trained in strategy through weeks of intensive preparation. The patterns of the enemy advance revealed something that the others had missed. "They're avoiding the eastern valleys," she noted, pointing to a conspicuous gap in the Confederacy's advance. "That terrain would be ideal for rapid movement toward our capital, but they're staying clear of it entirely." Torvald followed her observation with growing interest. "Why would they avoid such advantageous ground?" "Because they expect us to make our stand there," Elira replied, her mind working through the implications. "Lord Aldrich has been feeding them information about our traditional defensive strategies. They know exactly where we would normally position our forces, which routes we would use for supply lines, how we would attempt to funnel their advance into killing grounds." The revelation sent a murmur of concern through the assembled advisors. If their enemies possessed detailed knowledge of their military doctrine, conventional defensive strategies would be worse than useless. They would be walking into carefully prepared traps. "Then we need to do something completely unexpected," Torvald said, his voice carrying the authority of a king who had fought and won countless battles. "If they know our old ways, we give them something entirely new. The integrated units we've been training," Elira suggested, her eyes bright with strategic possibility. "Mixed alpha, beta, and omega forces using unconventional tactics. They'll be expecting traditional heavy cavalry charges and rigid formation fighting." "Exactly what I was thinking," Torvald agreed, his expression showing both pride and affection. Our enemies are preparing to fight the kingdom we used to be, not the kingdom we're becoming. Over the next several hours, they crafted a battle plan unlike anything in the kingdom's military history. Traditional alpha-led cavalry units would serve as visible decoys, drawing the Confederacy forces into positions where they expected to find easy victories. Meanwhile, the real assault would come from unexpected directions. Omega reconnaissance teams, who could move through terrain the enemy considered impassable. Beta engineering units, who could sabotage supply lines and communication networks. Mixed forces trained in guerrilla tactics that prioritized flexibility over brute strength. "This is madness," muttered Lord Thorne, one of the older military advisors who had served under 3 kings. "We're gambling the entire kingdom on untested theories and soldiers who have never seen real combat." "We're fighting for the soul of this kingdom," Elira replied firmly, her voice carrying new authority. "These soldiers aren't just fighting to preserve the old order. They're fighting for the chance to build something better. That gives them a motivation our enemies can't match." As the day progressed, messengers arrived with increasingly urgent reports. The Confederacy advance was moving faster than anticipated, and their forces were larger than initial intelligence had suggested. Worst of all, King Aldwin of Westmarch had not merely withdrawn from their alliance, he had actively joined the enemy coalition, bringing his substantial military forces to bear against them. "We're outnumbered nearly 3-1, Sir Marcus reported grimly. "Even with our new tactics, the odds are daunting." "Then we make sure every advantage counts," Torvald replied, his jaw set with determination. "Send word to every village, every settlement, every farm within 50 miles. Any who can fight, any who can support our forces, any who believe in what we're building here, now is the time to stand and be counted." The response to the call was extraordinary. Common folk, who had never been allowed to participate in their own defense, arrived at the castle in unprecedented numbers. Omega women, who had been dismissed as weak, proved themselves capable of remarkable endurance and tactical thinking. Beta craftsmen brought skills that transformed ordinary tools into effective weapons. Young people of all castes volunteered for dangerous missions with an enthusiasm that spoke of genuine investment in the outcome. Elira found herself at the center of this mobilization, her presence serving as a powerful symbol of the changes they were fighting to protect. When she addressed groups of volunteers, her words carried the weight of personal experience with oppression and the promise of a better future. "I know what it means to be told you are worthless because of circumstances beyond your control," she told a gathering of Omega volunteers in the castle's main courtyard. "I know the pain of having your contributions dismissed, your potential ignored, your very existence treated as a burden. But I also know that none of that defines your true worth. Today, we fight not just for our homes and families, but for the right of every person to be judged by their character and their choices rather than the accident of their birth." The cheers that greeted her words were unlike anything the castle had ever heard, not the polite applause of formal ceremony, but the raw enthusiasm of people who finally had something worth fighting for. In the evening, as final preparations were made for the coming battle, Elira and Torvald found themselves alone in his private study. The maps and battle plans had been set aside, replaced by a quiet moment of intimacy that felt precious given the uncertainty of what tomorrow might bring. "Are you afraid?" Torvald asked, his hand reaching across the small table to cover hers. "Terrified," Elira admitted honestly, "but also exhilarated. For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do." His fingers intertwined with hers, and she felt the familiar warmth that spread through her body whenever he touched her. Their relationship had deepened significantly over the weeks of crisis and preparation, evolving from political necessity to genuine partnership to something that felt very much like love. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Torvald said quietly, I want you to know that choosing you was the best decision I have ever made as king, not because of your bloodline, not because of political advantages, but because of who you are as a person. And I want you to know, Elira replied, her voice thick with emotion, that I love you. Not the crown, not the power, not the position you've given me, but you. The man who saw worth in a servant, who risked everything to do what he believed, was right, who treats every person in this kingdom as if they matter. Their first kiss was soft and tentative, a gentle exploration that spoke of hope and longing and the precious nature of the moment they were sharing. When they broke apart, both were breathing heavily, and Elira could see her own emotions reflected. In Torvald's eyes, "We're going to win tomorrow," she said with quiet certainty, "not because we're stronger or better equipped than our enemies, but because we're fighting for something they can't understand, the idea that people are more than the circumstances of their birth." "And then?" Torvald asked, his thumb tracing gentle circles on the back of her hand. "Then we build the kingdom we've both been dreaming of," Elira replied. "A place where worth is earned, where justice applies to everyone, where no child ever has to wonder if they're valuable enough to matter." As they sat together in the candlelight, surrounded by the evidence of their careful planning and the weight of tomorrow's responsibilities, Elira felt a peace she had never experienced before. She was no longer the frightened servant who'd been called from the shadows, nor even the uncertain noble who had only recently discovered her heritage. She was Queen Elira, chosen by love and proven by trials, ready to lead her people into battle for the chance to build something magnificent from the ashes of old prejudices and ancient hatreds. The war that awaited them would test everything they had built together, but she faced it with confidence, born of genuine partnership and unshakable conviction. Tomorrow would bring the ultimate test of whether their vision of a better kingdom could survive contact with those who profited from the old ways. But tonight, holding the hand of the man she loved and surrounded by the loyalty of people who believed in their cause, Elira knew that whatever the outcome, they had already achieved something remarkable. They had proven that change was possible, and that hope was stronger than fear. The battle standard of Drakmoor snapped proudly in the morning wind as Elira raised it high above the assembled forces, its deep blue field emblazoned with the silver crown and crossed swords that had rallied, defenders for 3 centuries. But the army that gathered beneath it was unlike any that had ever served the kingdom. Men and women of all castes standing together, united not by accident of birth, but by shared belief in a better future. "Today, we fight not as alphas, betas, or omegas," Elira called out, her voice carrying clearly across the field despite the wind that whipped through her hair. "Today we fight as one people, defending our home and our right to choose our own destiny." The roar that answered her was magnificent. Thousands of voices raised in defiance of those who would see them destroyed or subjugated. She could see the Confederacy forces massing on the horizon, their black banners stark against the grey sky, but for the first time since this conflict began, she felt no fear. Torvald rode up beside her, resplendent in his battle armor, but with an expression of fierce pride as he looked upon the force they had assembled together. "Are you ready for this?" he asked quietly. "I was born ready," Elira replied, surprised by the certainty in her own voice. "This is what my family died fighting for, the right of all people to live with dignity and purpose. Today, we finish what they started." The battle began, with the Confederacy's traditional cavalry charge, exactly as their intelligence had predicted. Thousands of mounted warriors thundered across the field toward what appeared to be the kingdom's main defensive line, Alpha Heavy, cavalry arranged in the classical formation that had been standard for generations. But the charge met empty air and carefully prepared traps. The defenders melted away like morning mist, revealing hidden pits and barriers that sent the enemy horses tumbling. It was a masterpiece of misdirection that bought them precious time, while the real battle began on 3 other fronts. To the north, Omega reconnaissance teams emerged from terrain the Confederacy had considered impassable, striking at supply lines with surgical precision. Their intimate knowledge of the land, gained through years of being overlooked and dismissed, proved invaluable as they moved like ghosts through forests and valleys their enemies had ignored. "First supply depot neutralized," came the report. From one of the communication runners, "They never saw us coming." From the east, Beta engineering units launched a coordinated assault on the enemy's siege equipment, using their technical expertise to turn the Confederacy's own weapons against them. Catapults that should have been bombarding the castle instead found their mechanisms sabotaged, their loads exploding prematurely among enemy formations. And from the south came the kingdom's new mixed units, Alpha warriors fighting alongside Beta tacticians and Omega scouts in formations that prioritized adaptability over rigid hierarchy. They struck fast and hard, then melted away before the enemy could organize an effective response. Elira found herself in the thick of the coordination effort, her position near the battle standard, making her a natural focal point for reports and orders. She had thought her role would be largely ceremonial, but the reality of combat demanded constant decision-making as situations evolved faster than anyone had anticipated. "The eastern assault is ahead of schedule," Sir Marcus reported, his armor splattered with mud, but his eyes bright with excitement. "The enemy's right flank is collapsing faster than we hoped. Tell them to press the advantage, but not to overextend," Elira replied instinctively. "If they push too far forward, they'll be cut off when the Confederacy reorganizes." She caught Torvald's approving nod from the corner of her eye and realized that her strategic instincts were sound. The years of watching and learning from the shadows had given her insights into human nature and tactical thinking that formal military training might never have provided. But the Confederacy forces were not easily defeated. As their initial strategy crumbled, they began to adapt with the professional competence that had made them dangerous enemies. Lord Aldrich appeared at the head of a reserve force, his banner flying alongside those of the enemy as he led a counterattack designed to retake the initiative. "He's targeting our command position," Torvald observed grimly as the traitor's forces began to advance toward their location. "He knows that if he can capture or kill you, it will demoralize our entire army. Then we don't give him the chance." Elira replied, her hand moving instinctively to the sword at her side, a weapon she had learned to use over the past weeks under the tutelage of the kingdom's best instructors. "Signal our reserves. It's time to show them what we're really capable of." The horn call that summoned their reserve forces was answered by the thunder of hooves and the battle cries of warriors who had waited their entire lives for this moment. But these were not the traditional heavy cavalry that enemies expected. These were mounted archers and light cavalry units trained in the hit-and-run tactics that had served nomadic peoples for generations. They struck Lord Aldrich's advance like lightning, appearing from unexpected angles to loose volleys of arrows before disappearing again into the confusion of battle. The traitor's forces, trained for conventional warfare, struggled to adapt to this fluid style of combat. "Beautiful," Torvald breathed, as their forces executed a complex pincer movement that caught the enemy advance in a crushing embrace. "I've never seen anything like it." But even as their innovative tactics proved their worth, Elira could see that the battle was far from over. The Confederacy had more forces than they had initially revealed, and reinforcements were arriving from the north that threatened to overwhelm their carefully planned defenses. "We need to end this quickly," she said, studying the flow of battle, with eyes that had learned to see patterns in chaos. "If this drags on much longer, their superior numbers will start to tell. What do you suggest?" Elira looked at the battle standard in her hands, then at the mixed forces that had rallied to their cause, and made a decision that surprised even herself. "I'm going to lead a direct assault on their command position," she announced. "If we can break their leadership, the rest of their army will lose cohesion." "Absolutely not," Torvald replied immediately. It's too dangerous, and we can't risk losing this battle because we were too cautious, Elira interrupted firmly. Our people are fighting and dying for the chance to build something better. I won't ask them to take risks I'm not willing to take myself. Before he could protest further, she spurred her horse toward the enemy lines, the battle standard of Drakmoor streaming behind her like a beacon of hope and defiance. She could hear Torvald's shout of alarm and the thunder of hooves as he raced to follow her, but her attention was focused entirely on the enemy commander's position and the path she would need to take to reach it. The charge that followed would be remembered in songs and stories for generations to come, the moment when a former servant turned queen led a desperate assault that would determine the fate of two kingdoms and the future of everyone who called them home. The crown of Drakmoor felt impossibly heavy in Elira's hands as she stood in the enemy commander's tent, its ancient gold catching the light from the oil lamps that flickered around the space where the Confederacy's leadership had planned their conquest. The battle that raged outside had reached its crescendo, and the moment had come for her to claim not just victory, but the authority to forge a new future from the ashes of the old. Lord Aldrich knelt before her, his hands bound and his face twisted, with rage and disbelief. Beside him, General Blackwood of the Confederacy stared at the crown with the expression of a man watching his entire worldview crumble before his eyes. "This is impossible," Blackwood breathed. "You're nothing, a servant, elevated above her station by a foolish king's whim." "I am Lady Elira of House Thornwick," she replied with quiet dignity, "rightful heir to the northern duchies, chosen queen of this realm, and the woman who just defeated your supposedly invincible army with forces you dismissed as worthless." Transformation in her bearing was complete now. Gone was any trace of the uncertain servant who had once scrubbed floors in silence. In her place stood a queen who had earned her crown through trials that would have broken lesser souls, who had united a fractured kingdom and led it to victory against overwhelming odds. "The northern duchies fell decades ago," General Blackwood snarled. "The Thornwick line was extinguished." "Clearly not," Torvald interrupted as he entered the tent, his armor bearing the marks of desperate combat, but his eyes bright with triumph and fierce pride. "As evidenced by the fact that the heir you failed to kill just personally led the cavalry charge that shattered your center line." The charge had been magnificent and terrifying in equal measure. Elira had ridden straight into the heart of the enemy formation, the battle standard of Drakmoor streaming behind her like a declaration of war against everything the Confederacy represented. The sight of their supposed victim leading the attack had demoralized the enemy forces, even as it inspired their own troops to superhuman efforts. "Your conspiracy dies here," Elira said, addressing Lord Aldrich directly. "Your communications with the Confederacy, your attempts on my life, your betrayal of the kingdom that granted you privilege and position, all of it ends now." Lord Aldrich's face contorted with fury. "You think this changes anything? You think that defeating us here will somehow transform the natural order? There will always be those who recognize the truth, that some are born to rule and others to serve, that bloodlines matter more than sentiment." "You're right about one thing," Elira replied calmly. "Bloodlines do matter, but not in the way you think." She gestured to the crown in her hands. "This represents not just royal authority, but the responsibility to serve all people equally. My bloodline taught me that lesson through 20 years of exile and suffering. Your bloodline apparently taught you only entitlement and cruelty." The sound of celebration could be heard from outside as word of the victory spread through their forces. But Elira knew that the real work was just beginning. Winning a battle was one thing. Building a kingdom worthy of the sacrifices made to defend it was quite another. "What happens to them?" Torvald asked, indicating their prisoners. "Lord Aldrich will face trial for treason," Elira decided. The Confederacy officers will be returned to their lands with terms for peace, generous terms that reflect the kingdom we're trying to build, rather than the one we're leaving behind. General Blackwood looked up at her with surprise. You would show mercy to those who sought to destroy you? I would show wisdom, Elira corrected. Revenge breeds more revenge. If we want lasting peace, we need to demonstrate that our way of governing produces better results than yours. The tent flap opened to admit Sir Marcus, his face flushed with excitement and relief. Your Majesty, Your Highness, the field is ours. The enemy forces that haven't surrendered are in full retreat. Our casualties are remarkably light, considering the odds we faced. And our new recruits? Elira asked. How did the integrated units perform? Better than anyone dared hope, Sir Marcus replied with obvious pride. The Omega reconnaissance teams disrupted enemy communication so effectively that their commanders were fighting blind. The Beta engineering units neutralized their siege equipment and turned their own weapons against them. And the mixed combat units, so I've never seen anything like their coordination and adaptability. The vindication of their new approach to warfare was complete, but Elira felt no satisfaction in proving the skeptics wrong. Too many good people had died today, regardless of their caste or kingdom of origin, and the weight of those losses would be part of the crown's burden. We need to tend to the wounded immediately, she commanded. All wounded, ours and theirs alike. And we need to send messengers to every corner of the kingdom announcing our victory and calling for unity rather than revenge. As the practical details of post-battle administration consumed the next several hours, Elira found herself thinking about the symbolic importance of what had just occurred. The crown of Drakmoor in her hands represented more than just her personal triumph. It embodied the possibility that power could be earned through character rather than inherited through accident. The ceremony that followed was unlike any coronation in the kingdom's history. Rather than taking place in the great cathedral with all the traditional pomp and circumstance, Elira was crowned on the battlefield itself, surrounded by the men and women who had fought to defend their shared vision of a better future. Today, we have proven that worth is not determined by the circumstances of one's birth, she said, as Torvald placed the crown upon her head. We have shown that unity is stronger than division, that justice is more powerful than privilege, that hope can overcome even the most entrenched hatred. The cheers that greeted her words came from every throat. Alpha, Beta, and Omega voices raised together in celebration of what they had accomplished and anticipation of what they would build next. But our work is not finished, she continued, her voice carrying across the field to reach every ear. Today, we won the right to create the kingdom we've dreamed of. Tomorrow we begin the harder task of making that dream a reality. As the crown settled onto her brow, Elira felt the weight of generations of responsibility flowing through her. She was no longer just the last heir of House Thornwick, or the servant who had risen to royalty. She was the first queen of a new, kind of kingdom, one where every person would have the chance to prove their worth through their choices rather than their bloodline. The setting sun painted the battlefield in shades of gold and crimson, casting long shadows that seemed to reach toward a future bright with possibility. The old order had fallen, brought down not by conquest, but by the simple power of people who refused to accept that their circumstances defined their potential. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, rebuilding, healing, and the delicate work of transforming ideals into institutions. But tonight, with the crown of Drakmoor upon her head and the hand of the man she loved in hers, Queen Elira stood as living proof that even the most impossible dreams could become reality for those brave enough to fight for them. 6 months after the Battle of Drakmoor Fields, Queen Elira stood in the great hall where her extraordinary journey had begun, holding the golden scepter of unity, a new royal artifact she had commissioned to symbolize the joining of old wisdom with new hope. The hall looked much the same as it had on that transformative morning when King Torvald had called her name, but everything else had changed in ways both subtle and profound. The tapestries on the walls still depicted the glorious victories of past kings, but new additions showed scenes of common folk working alongside nobility, of diverse armies united in common cause, of prosperity built through cooperation rather than conquest. The hierarchy that had once seemed as immutable as the stone foundations of the castle had given way to something more flexible, more humane, more worthy of the kingdom's people. The northern duchies have officially requested reunification with the kingdom, Sir Marcus reported as he approached the throne where she sat beside King Torvald. The Confederacy's hold on those lands crumbled completely once word spread of your victory and your true identity. The people there remember your mother fondly and are eager to be ruled by her daughter. Elira felt a deep satisfaction at the news, though it was tinged with sadness for all the years that had been lost to war and oppression. Send word that they will be welcomed home with joy, but also with the understanding that they will be joining a kingdom that has moved beyond the old ways. Noble blood still carries responsibility, but it no longer guarantees privilege without merit. The transformation had not been without its challenges. Some of the Alpha Lords had departed for other kingdoms rather than accept the new order, while others had grudgingly adapted when they realized that the changes actually strengthened rather than weakened the realm. The Beta nobles had largely embraced their expanded opportunities, and the Omega population had responded to their newfound dignity with a dedication and innovation that surprised even the most optimistic supporters of reform. How are the new academies progressing? Torvald asked, referring to the educational institutions they had established throughout the kingdom. Beyond our most ambitious projections, Elira replied with genuine pride. When you give people the chance to learn and grow regardless of their caste, it turns out they possess remarkable abilities that were simply never allowed to flourish before. The afternoon brought a steady stream of visitors and petitioners, each representing some aspect of the kingdom's ongoing transformation. A delegation of Omega merchants presented their proposal for expanded trade routes that would benefit communities previously excluded from commerce. A group of Beta inventors demonstrated devices that could revolutionize agriculture and manufacturing. Alpha warriors reported on the success of integrated military units that had proven themselves superior to traditional caste-based formations. Each interaction reinforced Elira's conviction that their victory on the battlefield had been only the beginning of something much more significant. They were not just ruling a kingdom. They were proving that entirely new forms of society were possible, that the ancient assumption that some people were inherently more valuable than others was not just wrong, but actively harmful to everyone involved. As evening approached, Elira found herself alone in the small garden that had been created in the castle's inner courtyard, a space filled with flowers from every region of the kingdom, symbolizing the unity that had emerged from diversity. The golden scepter of unity rested across her lap as she watched the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold. "Regrets?" Torvald asked as he joined her on the stone bench, his presence as comforting now as it had been challenging in those early days when she could barely believe he had chosen her. "None," she replied without hesitation. "Even the pain and fear were necessary parts of becoming who I needed to be. The servant who scrubbed floors in silence couldn't have led armies or united a fractured kingdom, but she was still me, and her experiences gave me the foundation for everything that followed." He took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in the gesture that had become as natural as breathing. Their marriage had been formalized in a ceremony that reflected their values, a celebration that included people from every caste and every corner of the kingdom, where vows were exchanged, not just between bride and groom, but between rulers and people. "The physicians confirmed it this morning," Elira said quietly, placing his hand gently on her still flat stomach. The heir you wanted will arrive early next spring. Torvald's face lit up with a joy so pure and complete that it took her breath away. A child who will grow up in the kingdom we've built together, he said wonderfully, who will never know what it means to be limited by the circumstances of their birth. A child who will inherit not just a crown, but a responsibility, Elira agreed. To continue building on what we've started, to push even further toward justice and equality, to never let the kingdom slide back into the old patterns of oppression. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell around them, each lost in contemplation of the future they were creating together. The golden scepter caught the light from the torches that illuminated the garden paths, its surface inscribed with words in the ancient tongue that spoke of unity, justice, and hope. "Do you think she would be proud?" Elira asked suddenly, thinking of the mother she barely remembered, but whose legacy had shaped everything that followed, Lady Ravenna. "I think she would be amazed," Torvald replied gently. "She fought for reforms within the old system. You've created an entirely new system that makes those reforms seem conservative by comparison." The thought brought her peace as they made their way back into the castle, past guards who nodded respectfully, but without the servile terror that had once characterized interactions between commoners and royalty. The halls they walked were the same ones where she had once moved invisible and unnoticed, but now they resonated with the sounds of a kingdom that was truly alive. Conversations between people of different castes, laughter from quarters where there had once been only fearful silence, the music of hope made manifest. In their private chambers, Elira placed the golden scepter of unity in its specially crafted stand, where it would rest until the next day. Brought new challenges and new opportunities to prove that their vision could endure. The worn cleaning cloth that had once symbolized her servitude was nowhere to be seen, replaced by symbols of authority earned through character rather than inherited through bloodline. "What do you think our child will make of all this?" Torvald asked as they prepared for sleep. "I think they'll take it for granted the way children always do." Elira replied with a smile. "To them, it will seem natural that people are valued for who they are rather than what they were born to be. And perhaps that's the greatest victory of all, making justice so normal that no one can imagine it being any other way." As she drifted off to sleep in the arms of the man who had seen her worth when no one else could, Queen Elira reflected on the long journey that had brought her from the shadows to the throne. Every challenge had strengthened her, every trial had prepared her for greater responsibilities. Every moment of doubt had been overcome by the support of people who believed in the possibility of something better. The kingdom she now ruled was not perfect. No human institution ever could be. But it was just, it was hopeful, and it was growing stronger every day. The child growing within her would inherit a world where dreams could become reality for anyone willing to work for them, where worth was earned rather than assumed, where the accident of birth was merely a starting point rather than a life sentence. And in the great hall where her story had begun, the morning sun would soon illuminate tapestries that told a new kind of tale, not of conquest and domination, but of unity and transformation, of a servant who became a queen not by abandoning her past, but by using it to build a better future for everyone who would come after. The golden scepter of unity stood as a testament to what could be achieved when people refused to accept that. The way things were was the way things had to be, and Queen Elira, once dismissed as worthless, now ruled as living proof that every person possessed the potential for greatness if only they were given the chance to prove it.